Well, hi there. Welcome back to my attempt at making up for spending the better part of the last decade thinking the survival horror genre was dead and there was no reviving it. In hopes of remedying that little mistake, I've been on a bit of a quest to find any and all modern titles that exhibit a certain Resident Evil-ness about their design. For those of you new to this whole concept, that basically means anything that checks most of these boxes. Backtracking-centric exploration with an emphasis on puzzle solving and item collecting, limited resources, inventory management, and of course an atmosphere of isolation and dread. Now I know you've got your own ideas on what makes something a survival horror game or a Resident Evil clone, but I'm using the first entries in the series as a baseline so we can have a nice solid example to draw from when making comparisons. So if that sounds like a good time to you, let's get this thing in gear and check out some modern RE clones. What's up guys, I'm Jared and this is Avalanche Reviews. Okay, so starting off, this one's going to be a bit rough to talk about. On one end, Cryospace is a guaranteed win in my book. It's a creepy horror story that takes place in the vacuum of space and follows what I would call a rough copy of Resident Evil's blueprints. And before you come in with the obviously this is inspired by Dead Space stuff, keep in mind Dead Space itself was also inspired by RE. When I first heard about this game, thanks to a lot of you guys in my comment section of the last video, I thought the name sounded a bit familiar, so I looked it up and found a trailer released all the way back in 2020. Comparing it with the most recent trailer on its Steam page, it seems clear the game went through a whole mess of changes, but honestly I'd say that's for the better. I really like the aesthetic they landed on here, and the atmosphere is just right. Okay, so then, what's with all the negativity at the start? Well, I hate to say it, but there's more wrong with this thing than right. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the demo available on the Steam page is an absolute mess. First up, the game says it allows for controller support, but I wouldn't use one if I were you. Not only are you unable to change the resolution past 640 by 480 with a PS4 controller, but you can only move your character around and not your aiming reticle, effectively making the demo unplayable. Past that, animations are jittery as all hell. Little things like crouching and standing back up again has your character's hands moving in and out like some kind of a weak melee attack, and since we're on that subject, your close quarters strikes lack any sound effects, which sucks all the air out of the combat real quick. I mean, I'm just now realizing that would make a very good space joke, so do something with that. On top of that, there is a constant shimmer going on underneath your feet, and past a certain point, my flashlight just stopped showing up. Now in the game's defense, for one short hallway sequence, it did come back again, but then a dialogue box caused it to go away, so I figured I might restart the demo to see if I could undo whatever caused it to mess up, but the game autosaves progress and gives you no option to load a previous save or start a new game, so I was just stuck with no lights for this run. When interacting with keypads, your mouse movements will still move your character around, and if you're not careful, you can click outside the boundaries of that keypad and fire off a round, wasting precious ammo. And since we're on the subject, sort of, moving around feels very awkward and hard to control. I mean, like, seriously hard to control. Now, there are two control schemes, which would be nice if one of them worked, but neither are particularly effective. On top of that, the voice acting here is pretty damn rough, and yes, that is sort of par for the course in the genre, but when it's not rough, it's just text-to-speech, and if you ask me, I don't know, that seems really cheap. I know this is a demo and they don't have everything together yet, but maybe just don't have any voice acting at all, and continuing that thought, the writing is, well, let's say not up to snuff.
Hello? Hello? I've woken up already. Why is it so dark in here?
At one point, there was a conversation in an audio log where a crew chief addresses an officer and identifies himself as Chief. Like just Chief, as if it was his first name, which got me thinking, is this guy's name and title together Chief, which is hilarious.
Alan, this is Chief. It is irrelevant right now. We have much bigger issues on our plate.
Okay, so admittedly I've been a bit mean so far, but I'm unloading all of this up front because I really think this thing has potential. The setting and atmosphere won me over right from the start, and for some reason I really can't say, I kind of like the overhead twin-stick shooter sort of perspective for this kind of game. When Cryospace does manage to run well, and the graphics or sound or controls aren't bugging out completely, there's some really awesome stuff on display, and I'm already into the mystery they're setting up.
Shut up.
Despite all the jank and issues, there are definitely things in this game that are worthy of praise, and I think at the top of that list is the physics. Since we're in some kind of a derelict craft just cruising through the darkness of space, there's no real gravity to speak of, so debris and bodies are just kind of floating through the air, and all that stuff interacts with you in a pretty realistic manner. It's honestly a really cool sight killing an enemy, watching the ragdoll physics kick in and their body just sort of succumb to the zero-G. It's interesting, and I didn't know I wanted this in the game so bad till I saw it here. Like I said, there is a lot of good here, but it seems like the game's technical shortcomings overshadow all of that by a not insignificant degree. According to the Steam page, Cryospace is planned to hit the scene sometime in 2023, and here's hoping that's on the latter end of that projection because this thing could use all the time in the oven it can get. I'm honestly pulling for this team though. They've got something here that could very well be a badass time if they can manage to get a handle on the bugs, which at this point outnumber actual in-game mechanics. From what I can tell, they've been getting a good amount of feedback, and most of what I listed here has been brought up to them, so if we're lucky, these guys will listen to those complaints. Cryospace may be just shy of a train wreck in its current form, but all hope is not lost. I'm pretty sure these are bugs that can be squashed, and we've seen people do some amazing things with Unity, so there's nothing preventing this from being an absolute banger outside of the team's skill at development. If anyone working on this game just so happens to be watching this section, please don't take these negatives as insults, but instead constructive criticism. I think Cryospace has real potential, and I would love to see it realized, and here's hoping that's exactly what happens. I'm rooting for you guys. And pivoting from a game that could be great, I figure it's time to talk about one that flat out is great. Fobia is a brand new survival horror title made by Brazil's own Pulsatrix Studios, and for a dev house that to my knowledge only has this one game under its belt, it's pretty damn impressive. I learned about Fobia and its hard to pronounce subtitle from comments in my previous RE Clone videos and a few tweets, so big thanks to anyone who shouted this out to me. I will admit, however, like most of my experiences with new indie-developed horror games, I came into this one with a lot of skepticism. I didn't really expect it to suck me in, so I played it safe at first and just grabbed the free demo off of Steam, and I'm serious when I say that by the time I saw the credits roll on that demo, I was already halfway through purchasing the game. Fobia starts out with a prologue that, well, I'm gonna be honest with you, does literally nothing for the story. It doesn't establish who you are, who the enemy is, or why you're locked up. Realistically, you'll learn much more just from starting the game proper. That being said, though, we do get to see our main character get his torso pierced, so that's fun. The game actually starts with an intro that establishes the fact that we are a reporter and we're checking into a hotel to follow up on a lead. Once we've got our room, we're greeted with a bit of a montage showing a week going by and our character comments on how he's no closer to solving whatever mystery he's after. In an attempt to end the day right, he goes to take a shower but is instead greeted by some kind of a rip in time space. We wake up some indeterminate amount of time later and the place is trashed. We have no idea what's happened in the interim, but we do know we're locked in this room and it's gonna take a little puzzle solving for us to get out.
Shit. It's stuck.
In the process of doing that, we get access to his laptop and we see that our boy was enticed to come here thanks to a forum post describing strange disappearances and odd sightings. He got in touch with the OP and set up a bit of an investigation, however when he showed up, he lost contact with the woman he was supposed to meet up with. Making this the very first time in recorded history someone's made plans with a woman on the internet and they fell through in real life. As the game continues, we find out that this all has something to do with a secretive cult and some kind of a strange power source. There are a few sections in the game where we take control over some guy in the 1920s, and I believe it's setting up the origin of how this cult came into owning this thing, but like a lot of the titles covered in these multi-game videos, I haven't had a chance to beat Fobia yet. Something I've been ironically getting a surprising amount of shit for lately, which I guess is going to have to keep on happening because I flat out don't have time to beat 6 or 7 games every week and a half. Getting back on track though, I am really enjoying Fobia's story. So far it's a lot more mystery than actual substance, but it's being delivered to me at just the right rate, and I'm super interested in getting to the bottom of all this. As far as gameplay is concerned, we've got just about everything you'd likely be looking for in a game so clearly inspired by old RE and SH titles. The hotel we're stuck in is in varying levels of desolation, and getting around isn't a simple concept of just taking the stairs and walking out the front door. There are collapsed sections, fires, and roadblocks of all kinds just waiting to impede your progress, and like you'd expect, nearly every damn door in the place is locked via some form of convoluted puzzle. Going through the process of navigating all the hurdles in your way will have you getting real damn intimate with the environment, which is good because this is another one of those games that refuses to give you a traditional map to follow. And like I've talked about before, this used to be something I really didn't enjoy. Even when playing classic RE games I know like the back of my hand, I tend to check the map every once in a while, but man, you'd be surprised how well you start navigating without one. It becomes second nature and you really don't notice the fact that it's gone after a little while. On the plus side, if that sounds like a bad time for you, there are floor maps posted in some areas and they are nice to check every so often, but they can be out of the way depending on where you're headed, so more often than not, you're probably just going to want to commit the place to memory. Your attacks are pretty slow and your enemies are relatively fast when they get in range, so it becomes a game of hitting weak spots that'll cause a stagger, which will let you get some more free hits in. Aiming your weapon, though, is a little strange at first, with a genuine old-school survival horror approach that I actually really enjoyed. What I mean by that is, even when your gun's out, you're still going to have to aim it, so you'll need to hold down one button to shoot and hit another to fire. It might seem strange in a first-person shooter to only be able to fire when aiming down sights, but you get used to it soon enough and it works fine after that. The puzzles in the game are surprisingly abundant. I mean, they're just all over the place and they are really satisfying to solve. Most of the time, the answer will be pretty easy to divine, but every once in a while you'll need to keep a real eye out for clues in the environment, some of which are, well, technically not really there. Okay, I know that sounds a bit crazy. Let me explain. Fobia's story deals with alternate timelines or universes. I really haven't figured that out yet, but either way, our main character has a lens attached to his camera that pierces the veil, as it were. Using your camera's viewfinder will let you see that same place but in a different time, and on top of netting you extra items, this can help you get through some of the aforementioned puzzles. And this isn't purely a surface level thing. You aren't just changing the way your environment looks. At certain points with the use of your camera, you'll be able to progress to a new area via some pathway that just doesn't exist in your time. I thought this was a really cool little gimmick to see, and it's handled remarkably well here. I mean, for one thing, it made sure I was always on my toes while exploring. Sure, maybe I was standing in an empty room right now, but who knows what kind of supplies might be found in some alternate timeline. And the cool thing is, the game would have still been totally amazing without this mechanic, so it's really nice to see the devs striving to innovate, especially when they don't necessarily have to. Fobia does have this persistent stalker character like Nemesis or Mr. X, but he only shows up in scripted areas and he's pretty easy to avoid once you put a few bullets in him. I know you guys have heard me rant about this before, but I have never really liked this kind of a concept in games where exploration and item conservation are of such importance. But if you are going to have it in your game, I think this is exactly how to handle it so that I don't feel cheated out of health or ammo when some unkillable death machine randomly shows up on my doorstep. Graphically, the game is a damn treat. The environments look absolutely stunning and the lighting is very impressive. Now, Fobia does take advantage of ray tracing, and in some select scenarios it does provide a clear advantage over traditional light maps, but most of the time I'd say it's not doing very much, which is reflected by the fact that I'm able to run this game upwards of 120 frames per second while it's enabled. Even with RTX on though, I still notice what looks like screen space reflections to me, which isn't the worst thing in the world to have in your game, but I have sort of grown to hate this grainy, crawling look that these reflections have to them. You can also see a bit of that classic Unreal Engine shininess on enemies and some elements in the environment, but that's something that's always been an issue with Unreal, or at least as long as I can remember, so no points docked there. I did, however, find it very annoying how overpowering the flashlight can be when you're really close to things, which wouldn't be so bad if it didn't also apply to the items you've picked up and are trying to investigate. Sometimes I'd find myself picking up a picture and I'd have to put it down, turn my flashlight off, and re-examine it just so I could see what the hell it was a picture of. Like I said though, the game is an absolute badass in the graphics department, so don't mistake a few very small issues for actual complaints. But if we are going to talk complaints, I'd say the only thing in Fobia that actually came close to getting on my nerves was the movement, or more precisely the perspective combined with the movement. Instead of making you a walking camera like most first-person titles, Fobia actually puts that camera within a rendered-out body, one that moves and animates as if this were a third-person game, and with that comes the strange concept of playing an FPS and moving around, but having to wait for that body to finish its animations before being able to move again. Okay, so I know that's a little hard to understand. I think the best way I can describe it is comparing it to Rockstar's Euphoria engine. Like, if I were to move around rapidly, I'd have to wait for my body to finish moving to the desired location before I could reliably change to the opposite direction. Kinda like my body was a few steps behind my head, maybe. Trust me, this isn't something that's gonna ruin the game, but every time I tried to simultaneously duck, change directions, or move my head, I remembered it was there. But hey, it being an entire-ass game and me only having one gripe with it is pretty unheard of, so other than that, I would say this is one hell of a modern RE clone. The gameplay checks every box I wanted it to, and the presentation and psychological horror atmosphere are expertly done. I really had trouble putting this one down, and if this video ends up being late, well, now you know why. In my opinion, fans of that classic Resident Evil gameplay loop will definitely get into Fobia, and if you find yourself doubting that, there is a free demo, so go and try it, and that should put that fear to bed pretty quick. If I had to rank it against other games that contain small children in gas masks jumping in and out of alternate dimensions/timelines, I'd say it's easily in the top 5. Have you ever gotten the feeling that a project was specifically made with you in mind? Well, that's how I felt about Brutal Japan. This is a low-budget horror title set in a regular-ass Japanese neighborhood and gives off heavy survival horror vibes. Its creator says that they were inspired by the Siren series, and you can definitely see that influence, but without the site-jacking mechanic, I'd say this fits pretty firmly into the realm of an RE clone. Brutal Japan is an early access game, and I don't think I'm going to step on anyone's toes when I say that's pretty clear right from the start. It is incredibly rough around the edges, and, well, if I'm being honest, I'd venture to say it's kind of bad. And we will definitely work out exactly why that is, but before we do, let's get down to brass tacks. Like I said earlier, Brutal Japan as a concept is just killer. You play as a Japanese guy who lives in a rough part of town so that he can save on rent every month, and one late night after getting off of work, he seems to have lost his keys somewhere, which, in a weird way, is probably the most horrific scenario we've covered in this video series so far. Seriously, you ever lose your keys before? It's like the worst situation imaginable. Well, anyways, so now in the dead of night, this guy has to explore this eerily quiet neighborhood so he can find his keys and get home. In the process of doing just that, he stumbles on some weird homeless guy who attacks him out of nowhere, and now he's got to sneak his way around what seems to be a never-ending army of homeless guys, or maybe it's supposed to be just one dude, I'm not really sure. Which means you'll be doing a lot of running and not so much fighting. And yes, I do have some spicy thoughts on non-combat horror games not being survival horror, but there is a component in this game that'll have you smashing the less fortunate with an umbrella or a broken bottle, so it looks like I once again win on a technicality. Really though, that's all there is to the gameplay. You find some items around the environment, use them to solve some very rudimentary item-based puzzles, and try to dodge a homeless guy, so I guess we could stop burying the lead here. Like I said, I really did not like this game, and most of that is due to what I have to assume are mistakes or errors. Because if they're not, these guys just actively hate the people playing their games. Alright, so allow me to elaborate on that. The first thing you're going to notice is the fact that the keyboard is the only officially supported way to play the game, which isn't terrible. I mean, I played through whole-ass Resident Evil games using a keyboard, and it actually works pretty well. What doesn't work, though, is this game's controls, or I guess more importantly, their sensitivity. You can use either ASWD or the arrow keys to move around, but regardless of which you prefer, just looking in the direction of the left or right keys is going to have your character nearly pulling a 360. Seriously, the turning controls are so damn sensitive, I never really got used to them. I had to start just barely tapping left or right, which is really hard to wrap your head around when you don't have to be that careful using the up direction. Oh, and just in case you were wondering, the down arrow literally does nothing. I don't even think it has a function map to it in the game. Moving on from there though, the point of the game is to avoid the wandering homeless guy, and doing that can be a lot harder than it sounds. This asshole moves in a manner that Random doesn't even begin to describe. The guy's constantly changing direction, and I found no real strategy to work in terms of just getting by him unnoticed. If he does catch wind of you, he'll give chase, and typically that lasts until you've gained enough ground for him to give up. The game does give you a sneaking option with a crouch sort of walk, but I still got noticed while crouching, and thanks to the random nature of the enemy's movements, I just ran everywhere. Because if I'm going to play a game that's actively working against me, I'd rather not extend that time by creeping along at a snail's pace. Getting away from your homeless attacker is simple enough, but you can't interact with items while he's chasing you, and you're gonna need to do that to progress, so have fun with that. Oh, and I nearly forgot to mention, the game often just spawns this guy in a few feet in front of you, so even if you are being incredibly careful, you are still going to struggle with getting caught. At one point, the game would just spawn this guy in as soon as I rounded a corner. No matter how I did it, fast, slow, it didn't matter, he would just appear out of nowhere, which is a real problem because this is a very small section of the map and there were things I needed to interact with which can't happen while being chased. So I would just run back to the beginning of the area to catch my breath and try again later, and I went through this process maybe 7-8 times. Later I found out this section contains the one and only object you can actually interact with while being chased, and as you can imagine, that was really fun. Oh, and the best part was that 2 or 3 hits kills you, which forces a restart to just about the beginning of that chapter. And if I had to guess, I would say this section killed me maybe 4 times, which meant I spent a lot of my playthrough just making it back to this part. And to add insult to injury, there's an autosave maybe a minute's worth of progress from this point. I also ran into issues picking stuff up even when I wasn't being chased because the text prompt that tells you can pick something up appears long before you're close enough to actually do what it says. I think this thing is a little too specific with where you can and can't be to interact with stuff, so expect to spend a lot of time finding that one square pixel it wants you to stand on before you can pick up that item. In the game's favor though, this is a really effective atmosphere that comes from, in my opinion, it taking place in a really effective setting. This place looks convincingly like your average Japanese neighborhood, specifically mine in Nakano, and while yes, this might be one of the safest countries to live in on Earth, I've got to admit there is an odd creepiness to walking the streets late at night and experiencing the isolation of seeing no one else around and the eerie quiet that can fall over a place that lies just a minute or two from a major road. So definitely an A+ on the atmosphere, and I think that's helped along by a lot of cool visual options. Obviously, this is a pretty simple looking game, but it includes a 4x3 option, which is always nice, and a VCR screen filter that I actually liked. After starting the game with this filter on, I could not go back to how clean it looks without it. And keeping with the upward momentum, there are a few different endings, which is actually really nice. One time I ended up beating the homeless guy to death, which took a considerable amount of effort, believe you me, and after getting my keys and returning home, my character ended up getting hauled off to jail. The tabloids called me the office-working homeless hunter or something like that, which is absolutely hilarious. And more funny than that is my next playthrough where I hit him just enough to get him to drop the keys and circle back to pick them up. For this one, I get home and decide no monthly savings are worth going through that again, so I end up in a nicer part of town and things are going well for me. Until I get a notice from a lawyer representing that homeless guy saying he's willing to sue me for scarring him while literally defending myself from his attacks. The sad part being this is probably the most plausible and realistic ending you can get. Now, I'm almost positive there's at least one more, but honestly, I'm not trying to play through this game again. In the end though, this is an early access game, so there is hope the developer can iron out these incredibly annoying bugs because this could really be an awesome time based solely on the look and feel of it alone. They seem to be aiming for releasing a few more scenarios, which to be honest I really wouldn't be interested in playing unless they see some serious polish. I will keep my eyes on this one because there is some promise here, just not enough to warrant the absolute pain that is playing through it again. If you are interested, it's only going to run you maybe $2 or $3, and perhaps a few more purchases will get their asses in gear on improving things here, but if not, at least I got to play a very interesting walking at night in Japan simulator. One that, according to the developer, is indistinguishable from Japanese reality. Okay guys, we need to have ourselves a bit of a talk. For as long as I can remember, viewers have been recommending I play Lone Survivor, and I can totally understand why. I mean, if there's two things I love in this world, it is good pixel art and survival horror gameplay, and both are most definitely represented in this game, but here's the catch. I just flat out do not like it. And believe me, this is not a recent revelation. On and off for years I've tried to get into Lone Survivor, and each time I restarted I think to myself, maybe I was tired last time, or I just wasn't in the right mood for this type of game, but I am never able to get very far in this thing. Before we get into that though, we should talk about how the game works, and then maybe we'll try and figure out what exactly is wrong with my brain on this one. Lone Survivor is the story of this guy. In the intro, he says his name's not important, so I guess we'll never know who he is, but according to him, there's been some sort of an outbreak, and the only reason he's still alive is because he shut himself in his apartment and rarely, if ever, left. The game starts, and the general goal is to find some more supplies to keep our guy alive for just a little longer, but it's not long until we start seeing some cracks in his story. Our main character seems to be almost constantly hallucinating and even conjures up people to talk to. In fact, the sparse amount of dialogue you get in the game seems to point the direction that these people may even not exist. And without finishing the game or ever looking up its story, I can already call dibs on this being some sort of a Silent Hill 2 thing. You know what I mean, the kind of story where everything is actually an allegory for the protagonist coming to grips with some sort of past trauma or terrible thing that he's done that's torn his psyche apart. I'm calling it right now, you guys let me know in the comments if I'm right or not. Our man sometimes sees this guy with a box on his head both in the real world and in his dreams, and sometimes has Twin Peaks Red Room style visions of himself sitting next to some guy and refusing to talk to him. So on top of the whole Silent Hill 2 prediction thing, I'm gonna go ahead and throw the unreliable narrator trope in there with it as well. Like I said before, I've never beaten this game, and really I'm not interested in ever trying, so there's definitely a lot I'm missing out on, but to be totally honest, the level of cryptic dialogue at the start did not move me in the opposite direction. I'm being dead serious when I say that a lot of the interactions I experienced in this game felt like they could have been written by Neil Breen.
Programmable matter.
We will all be connected telepathically.
Special agencies are prepared.
Gameplay-wise, we've got a few different elements overlapping here. At first, you have no real means to defend yourself, so you'll need to sneak around enemies using hiding spots or chunks of rotten meat to distract them, and this actually works pretty well. After a while, you will get your hands on a gun, and just like you'd expect in a survival horror game, ammo's going to be scarce, meaning you're only going to want to use it when you have to. On the plus side, the game does give you some form of combat avoidance in most situations, but since you'll be traveling back and forth using the same routes over and over again, you might want to plug a few of these creeps just to make your life a little easier. While exploring and finding items that'll unlock more of the apartment complex, you'll also run into the need to eat and sleep, and this is a major stumbling block for me. I mean, sure, eating is easy enough. You'll find foods and snacks in the environment, and you can eat most of them on the spot, but it's the sleeping that bothers me. On top of being crazy as all hell, I'm pretty sure our main character here is suffering from a severe vitamin deficiency because it seems like he can't play for more than 5 consecutive minutes without him complaining about needing to sleep, and this means halting all forward progress to return to your apartment. Now you can sometimes encounter a dream sequence when you do this, which sort of makes the trip feel a little more fruitful, but most of the time you'll just be trekking back there to refill some invisible gauge. Luckily, you can fast travel by looking at mirrors, so it's not as bad as it could be, but this guy's narcolepsy still kicks in just when I'm starting to get into the groove of things, which means I have to stop the part of the game I enjoy to engage with the part that I don't. Continuing with the complaints, I really did not like the way the game map is laid out here. Now, we have covered quite a few 2D survival horror games in the series, and I've really enjoyed all of them, but where they differ from Lone Survivor is in the Y-axis. LS has you solely navigating a single horizontal plane, and that makes the map incredibly hard for my brain to memorize. The perspective changes so randomly from room to room, it's hard for me to keep track of exactly where I am and how I got there. Okay, so that might be a little hard to explain, so let me give you an example. You may enter a door directly behind, or I guess above your character, depending on how you look at it, but then you end up in a room where the door you just walked through is on the left-hand side of the screen. There's just no concrete point of reference that lets you know what direction you're actually headed in, and at this point I'm sure you're probably yelling at me to just use my map, but that's the real kicker. Past the first 20 minutes of the game, I just couldn't get this little shit to pull the damn thing out. Every time I'd hit the M key, he'd say he knows this area like the back of his hand, and I guess that's nice, but I don't. Honestly, guys, if I had any hair at all, I would have pulled it all out trying to figure out how to open the damn map up. So I did a little bit of research, and it seems like this is actually a glitch. Apparently for some people, the game just turns their normal difficulty save into expert mode when they quit out of the game and try to reload that save, so that's fun. And I think that perfectly leads me into another issue I have. Apparently this game is essentially just a flash title, and because of that, there are no traditional controls over how you want to play it. I mean, come on, this thing is just begging to be played with a controller on PC, but when I try to use my PS5 or PS4 controller, hitting start or any other two buttons just exits the damn thing. On that same note, you have absolutely no way to alter the resolution or switch to windowed mode, which wouldn't be as much of a big deal if the game didn't use big chunky pixels. Pixels that at 4K are so large that text becomes incredibly hard to read and small details are almost unseeable. Now, it's not exactly unplayable for me, but depending on how good your eyesight is or how close you are to your monitor, it may be for you. Now, there is what the game calls an aspect ratio hotkey that you can hit at any point, but it just crops the top and bottom of the screen. It doesn't increase the resolution or decrease the amount of stretching that's going on, so it's effectively useless unless you really like forced letterboxing, I guess. Okay, I know I've been complaining a lot, but I really want to put this out there. I do not think Lone Survivor is a bad game. Sure, there are some general game design issues that I think gets in its way, but a lot of people seem to like this thing, and I can 100% see why. It has an awesome atmosphere, great pixel art, and a soundtrack that is flat out to die for. It technically does a lot of the things I enjoy so much in the genre, but I just cannot force myself to have fun with it. I truly don't know what it is about this game, but I get bored playing it about an hour in every single time I start it. This time I did make it to an hour and a half, but I just wasn't enjoying myself, so I'm gonna have to say something very odd here. Lone Survivor is a game I positively do not like, but damn it, I wish I did. I want to know the payoff for the mystery it's setting up, and I love most of what it's doing in theory. The sound effects, exploration, pixel art, atmosphere, and general mood are all guaranteed bangers for me normally, but something's keeping me from getting into this one. So I guess I'll say this. Even though I really don't enjoy Lone Survivor, I'd still recommend you guys give it a shot. It's around 15 bucks on Steam, and for that price point, I'd say most of you stand a good chance of getting some kind of return on your investment. For all I know, there might just be something about the way I'm wired that keeps me from seeing what everyone else sees here, but if that's not the case, let me know in the comments if you're of the same mind. It'd be nice to feel like I'm not crazy. Well, let's say less crazy, maybe. In my last video on RE clones, I found myself smitten with the first Heaven Dust. Sure, it did have a few kinks I thought could have been worked out, but it accurately mimicked that original RE gameplay style, which is exactly what I look for in this series. Well, this week I decided to see if the sequel could deliver on everything that made the first one so good while patching a few of the holes that bothered me, and interestingly it did just that. Heaven Dust 2 takes place right after the first game, with our main character narrowly making it out of the lab, only to be captured by the same company that put him in that life or death situation in the first place. And after spending a little bit of time in what is explained to be some kind of a sleep pod, I guess, this guy wakes up to the same exact scenario as last time. It seems like someone high up in the company is leaving him clues and is looking to collaborate on getting their collective asses out of Dodge before this new compound blows up. This time around, I was pretty damn stoked at the inclusion of an honest-to-goodness story delivered by something other than journal entries. There are other characters you can actually interact with here in Part 2, and their inclusion really helps this feel like a more substantial tale than the last one. This very well may just be a retread of the first game's events, but since Part 1 didn't have much of a story to speak of anyways, I'm pretty confident in saying you might as well just start with this one if you're looking to play Heaven Dust. And I'm happy to say the same goes for its gameplay. Heaven Dust 2 plays exactly like its predecessor, only with a little more polish applied. You'll still be running around a large pharmaceutical lab in the midst of a viral outbreak, and just like before, that process is the real bread and butter of the experience. Of course, you know this song and dance already. You'll slowly unlock more of the compound as you progress, finding key items and solving puzzles, which you should definitely be expecting from any game on this ever-growing list. Other than a very noticeable jump up in general tightness as far as gameplay mechanics go, I was also really happy to see more puzzles here in Part 2. It seems like every major area has more than 10 significant puzzles to solve before you can move on, and I'm happy to say they are just challenging enough to make you feel accomplished when you solve one, while staying away from that dreaded moment in survival horror games when you get stumped and have no idea how to proceed. On the flip side of that coin, I'd say fans of the genre might find these to be a little easy, but in my opinion they're getting close to just the right kind of difficulty. Solutions are usually found within a few rooms of the puzzle itself, and more often than not you can find out how to triumph over a head scratcher by looking at your surroundings just a bit closer. There were a few times where I nearly got close to getting stumped, but then I would notice some tiny detail I had just passed by and suddenly I knew exactly what to do. Honestly, it's sort of strange such a low-budget title would do this well with an aspect of the genre even big AAA developers often trip over. And speaking of compliments, the combat here follows in the same steps of all the other mechanics by being exactly like what you could find in the first game, only polished to a mirror-like sheen. Instead of only relying on random critical hits, you can stay locked onto an enemy for a certain period of time, which will net you a headshot. Of course, you can still get the odd random critical, but now it feels like you have a little more control over combat. If you approach a situation correctly, you should be able to down the opposing zombie before they get within striking distance using carefully timed headshots, but if something does get too close, you can still unload on them with unfocused shots from the hip and earn yourself a little breathing room. Part 2 adds grenades to the mix, which are expectedly handy, and because this is a survival horror game, that means you will always be just on the verge of running out of them. They can also be used as a resource to gain access to items you wouldn't otherwise be able to get your hands on, so that makes them more valuable and interesting. Gone are the stat upgrades and collectible currency from the first game, which you won't see me crying over, but you can find gun parts scattered around which will apply very similar buffs to your weapons. You can still come across spent shells and combine them with gunpowder to get ammo, only this time they aren't seemingly randomly spawned into the environment, so it feels a little more balanced. There's a few different types of malformed monstrosities you can come across this time around, each one requiring different tactics, like using a shotgun to blast away protective bones that have grown over a weak spot, or using electrical grenades or a machine gun to deal with enemies that can rapidly heal. I came across a few boss fights as well, which is always nice to see, and as you might expect, or at least hope for, these were also a bit of a puzzle in terms of getting through them without spending every last round you have. Oh, and this was actually really cool. They fixed the issue I had with constantly having to travel back and forth between item boxes because my inventory was so small. Now, not only do you have more room in your inventory than before, but you can also find upgrades for it. Not to mention the fact that your guns no longer take up space as long as they're equipped. Man, talk about listening to feedback. Really, the only criticism I could think of while writing this script up was the fact that healing items are a little more plentiful here than in the first game, which is crazy because I was always flush with them back then as well. Graphically, Heaven Dust 2 carries a similar style as the first game, but much more visually impressive. They stuck with the more chibi proportions, which is fine by me, but the general artistry is clearly much better here. The environment has a lot more details in it, and zombies are a little more gruesome this time around, but still pretty cute. On that note, I love it when enemies show bullet holes when you shoot them. I'm not sure why, but I've always really enjoyed this little detail, and you don't see it in games enough, even nowadays. Back in my last video covering Heaven Dust 1, I got a lot of comments bewildered by the fact that I would play the first game first, which I thought was a little weird, but now that I played the sequel, I can definitely see where you guys were coming from. Heaven Dust 2 is amazingly fun and perfectly fits that empty void left behind every time you realize Capcom will never release another survival horror game again. It transplanted everything I enjoyed about the first game over while fixing almost every single complaint I had. As a sequel, it deserves praise for doing what most never do, but as an RE clone, it deserves a spot in your library. This thing's only gonna run you $15 on Steam to grab a hold of, and I would say it's a steal at that price. You can finish this game in maybe 3 hours on a first run, and if you ask me, that's about the sweet spot for these type of games. If you've been watching these videos looking for an RE-like experience to add to your backlog, you've likely already looked into this one, but if you're new to the genre, I would say this would make for an awesome point to jump in at. HD2 gives you a great idea of what you can expect from the genre and acts as a nice little bridge between the modern era and the more tried and true design of old survival horror games. And if all of that didn't convince you, you can fight a bone worm in this game, which is incredibly ironic because it's armored on the outside by the one thing it will never have on the inside. Man, there's some kind of allegory for like depression or something in there. Hey guys, before we get into one of my favorite titles covered in this video, I'd like to thank Jordan Allen, small YouTuber and all-around nice guy. Jordan here is essentially sponsoring this video, so instead of trying to sell you guys on some product I really don't care about and you definitely don't, I figure it'd be nice to put the spotlight on someone up and coming in the YouTube game. So big thanks to Jordan for bringing this video to all of you guys. If you'd like to show some appreciation, I'll link his channel down in the description and in the card that should be showing up in the corner right now. He uploads a wide swath of content, but in my humble opinion, I'd say he's got a real knack for movie reviews. He's covered bangers like Prisoners and Good Time, but most recently, he put out a video recommending Mystic River, a recommendation I 100% back, by the way. Anyways, like I said, I am very thankful to Jordan for his flat-out badassery. Do me a favor and swing by his channel, let him know what you think or what you'd like to see in the future, and that being said, let's get back into the meat of this video.
Come on, kid, get your ass up there.
Murder House is another one of those games I've been getting recommended for as long as I can remember, and with its general aesthetic, you'd figure I would have covered it a very long time ago. I mean, come on, Puppet Combo, did the ring affine texture warping? Be honest. Did you guys make this game just for me?
You gotta help me. The Easter Bunny's trying to kill me.
I started out with the prologue chapter, which takes place before the main game and sets up the star serial killer of the show. You play as a kid who somehow was able to sleep after sitting on this monstrosity's lap and accidentally dozed off in a photo booth, locking him in the mall after hours. Oh, and right off the bat, I'd like to say Murder House checks every single box needed to be a piece of 80s media, which are the 3 M's: mullets, malls, and murderers. Nicely done, guys. After exploring the mall a bit, you find your way to a back room that may or may not lead you out of there, but not before you notice that you're not alone. Shortly after entering that back room, you encounter the Easter Ripper, and since you're only armed with one hell of a haircut, there's not much you can do but hide. Following that, there's some very well appreciated survival horror item collecting and puzzle solving, which will lead you to a nice janitor who offers to lock you in his office while he searches for the killer, but that doesn't necessarily work out. And that's where the prologue ends. The game proper starts off with the local news crew making their way out to the Easter Ripper's house years after his capture. Apparently the realtor has made a $50 deal with this sleazy news producer guy, and the team is looking to make some kind of a special report from inside the house of a famous killer. Right from the start, things are less than ideal with the real estate guy not showing up and you not being able to get into the house. But eventually you get control of your character, a lowly intern, and after breaking into the place and doing some preliminary filming, things start to go in the opposite direction you would want. The news van we rode in on is now demolished, and somehow the Easter Ripper is back and up to his old tricks again, those old tricks of course being murder. so the goal is to make it out of the house and avoid having your insides become your outsides. Murder House does a great job mimicking that early PS1 survival horror gameplay that hopefully we all love so much, with a very, very heavy emphasis on puzzle solving and item hunting. The game does technically have combat in it, although mostly you'll be hiding from the Ripper, but here's the weird thing. I never really had to, for some reason. From what I've heard, the murderer is supposed to show up randomly while you're exploring the house and try to kill you, but I kid you not, he never once showed up in my playthrough. Outside of scripted cutscenes and the final encounter, I never saw the guy. I'm not really sure what's going on there, or whether or not I'm lucky or unlucky in that sense, but either way, I don't know, I guess that's worth mentioning. The item-based progression is a nice blend of adventure game logic and easy enough to intuit stuff, so you shouldn't get stuck on any roadblock for too long. If you do find yourself scratching your head though, I'd suggest checking random rooms. The game often moves your crewmates around during the story, and most of the time talking to them will trigger the next event. So overall, things are on the more satisfyingly easy side as far as puzzles go. Well, except for this piano puzzle here. I really don't know what it is about survival horror games and piano puzzles, but they are always a massive pain in my ass. Movement is handled with tank controls, just like the good Lord intended, and they work pretty okay. The controls are a tad on the sensitive side, so it's easy to overshoot a turn or get stuck on the environment, but I think the biggest culprit here is the camera. Murder House has a very Silent Hill type of camera, where it follows a sort of preset movement model. There are all these cinematic sweeps and pans, and it really makes for awesome shots, but controlling your character in these almost always changing perspectives can be a little hard. Just like Silent Hill, you can hold a shoulder button which will stop the camera in its tracks and direct it towards your back. And again, just like Silent Hill, this genuinely might mess with those of you who are prone to motion sickness. It's not horrible or anything, and you will get used to the controls, but it's certainly not what I would call ideal. To be honest though, I think it might be a sacrifice worth making, because some of the horror movie-esque camera angles, sweeps, and pans are just amazing looking. On the presentation side of things, like I said before, this is essentially my preferred look. It masterfully hits that low poly benchmark with smart use of 90s era limitations like low draw distance, dithering, and affine texture warping, but that's only half the story. MH over here probably has the best looking video filters out of any game I've covered for this series. Not only is there a CRT effect, but two for both RF and composite video connections. Very nice attention to detail. Personally, if I wasn't recording footage for a platform whose compression really dislikes static, I would have played with the VHS filter on because this thing looks amazing. There's also a black and white mode, and if you don't like the lower render resolution, you can turn off PS1 mode and see gross-ass smooth polygons. Ew. You can also up the frame rate if you want, but really I wouldn't recommend it. The PS1 setting has it feeling exactly like it looks, and I think that completes the overall package. Murder House has a classic look that manages to walk a very thin line between accuracy and artistically pleasing visuals. I really just appreciate the consistency here. Everything from menus to the title screen keeps that old 80s video rental aesthetic, and it really helps pull you into the time period this thing takes place in. On that same note, the music is absolutely killer. It's a great combination of 80s appropriate synth melodies and horror movie screeching noises. I really enjoyed it. Honestly, I'm struggling to think of something I didn't like about the game, and really my only complaints almost cancel themselves out.
You're lucky you have this after the incident with the poodle.
That could have happened to anyone.
For example, it does suck that I didn't get to experience the main bad guy outside of the prologue chapter, but that sort of works out for the best in my opinion. I'm not going to go into exactly why, but I never really got into the whole persistent invincible stalker thing. Similarly, this is a pretty short experience, taking me just shy of 3 hours to complete, but really I think it ends exactly when it should. The puzzles and item hunting are great here, but in reality, this is just a normal house with maybe an above average amount of rooms in it. I don't think they could have squeezed another 15 minutes out of this location without it feeling artificially padded. And besides, for a survival horror game, 2 to 3 hours is pretty close to average. In my opinion, Murder House is perfect. For what it is. It's a great look back at an old genre using a look and style that will be very familiar to the people most likely to have grown up with that genre. It's not an epic story with lots of intricately overlapping mechanics, but instead a tightly focused and masterfully executed look back at what I would call a better time. It mirrors old games in a way that's both fun in terms of nostalgia, but also well put together in terms of a polished modern experience. Normally, Murder House sits at about $12 on Steam, and I truly could not think of a better way to spend your money. Usually when I play these games to get footage, I'll do it off and on in between homework and taking care of real life stuff, but I sat down with Murder House tonight, and as I write this, it is 4:47 in the morning. I played it all the way through in one sitting because I just couldn't put it down, and immediately I wanted to write this section of the script so that all the memories were fresh in my head. Hopefully that's enough praise to get you interested, but on the off chance that it's not, perhaps this wonderful scene of low poly gore will sweeten the deal a bit for you.
Help me find an exit!
Well guys, I think that's going to do it for today. I know this one was a little shorter than the last few videos in the series, but I think I'm starting to run into the end of my list here. Now you guys have definitely recommended me a bunch of titles, but I found a lot of them to be unfinished or short proofs of concept, and I didn't exactly want this to be a series where I just try nothing but demos. On top of that, I think I've shown you nearly everything that fits my definition of the genre and has a level of quality that, in my opinion, makes it worth pointing out. Throughout this process, I played a ton of short teasers, and there's definitely potential to be found in a lot of the stuff out there. But with the state of indie games and how little of them end up getting finished, I think this might be a good place to call it for now. Sadly, I am going to have to wait till a few more substantial titles are created in the genre to make another one of these videos, but on the plus side, I am thrilled that we are currently living through a time where I can reasonably expect that'll happen. Some of the younger people in the audience may not know this, but the survival horror boom did not last very long. Not counting this recent revival, the genre's been dead much longer than it ever lived, so I'm really happy to see developers with skill, heart, and drive jumping into a style that's near and dear to so many of our hearts. If by chance any of these fledgling dev houses happen to be watching this, just know there is a real and dedicated audience for what you're working on, and we're all behind you. Long live survival horror. And with that, I think I'm gonna have to get out of here, but I really want to thank you all for accompanying me through this journey. It's definitely something I wish I would have done earlier, but discovering awesome games in a once thought lost category is definitely better done late than never. Just as soon as I've compiled another nice long list of RE clones, best believe I'll be back with another volume, but until then, as usual, I'm Jared.
Ew, it's musty.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Well, hello friends, thank you for hanging out for a bit today. If you're into modern or retro RE clones, I've definitely got something you'll like linked on screen, and if you think this work is worth supporting, I'd appreciate you swinging by my Patreon. I truly couldn't do what I do, and I certainly couldn't do it where I'm doing it without their help. If you can't afford that expense though, no worries at all. A quick like, subscribe, or comment does this channel an entire world of good. So a big thanks to all of you for helping me achieve a lifelong dream, and here's hoping I can keep this going for a little while longer. Thanks guys, have a good one, and I'll see you later.